So, Dr. Hunger, do farmers accept fungicides as a normal part of their production process now? What have you seen trending in your 20-some odd years at Oklahoma State?
Well, I think certainly now compared to when I first got to Oklahoma in the 80s that growers are looking more at fungicides as a way to protect their yields. They still have to use the decision-making process of matching their yield potential with use of a fungicide to justify it, but they sure see it as a way to incorporate it as a management practice.
So now, what are the top 3 reasons, in your opinion, that farmers should use seed treatments, fungicidal seed treatments?
Controlling common bunt or stinking smut and loose smut is a primary reason to use a seed treatment. Genetic resistance to those diseases just is not incorporated into varieties anymore, and so the way to do that is with a seed treatment, which are very highly effective at controlling those diseases. Also using a seed treatment to control aphids and subsequent barley yellow dwarf infestations and infections is a second reason, because the aphids in Oklahoma and Kansas planting date has been moved earlier and earlier because of using wheat as a dual purpose crop. With that earlier planting date, there's a much longer period of time in the fall for aphids to become established on plants and transmit barley yellow dwarf, and it's those fall barley yellow dwarf infections that are the most damaging. And then, of course, seed treatments also will help emergence, help with seedling vigor a little bit, protect that seedling vigor, help them to become established, not always resulting in a large increase in yields, but certainly at least maybe a 1, 2, or 3 bushel an acre increase, which is enough to satisfy or to break even on the cost of application, and maybe even a little bit more.
Okay. So, Dr. Hunger, you mentioned today that there are more and more stripe rusts and other rust families coming into Kansas and Oklahoma. What are some ways that farmers can combat those rusts in their wheat fields?
Well, they have to be alert and scouting their fields. They have to be watching for it, and they should also be listening to reports from states to their south. In Oklahoma, we listen to what's happening in Texas in terms of leaf rust and the foliar diseases in the springtime, because there's a rust flyway that goes from Texas through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and on up north into Canada. And so those, if you hear of severe stripe rust or leaf rust occurring south of you, that means spores will be blowing up from the south, and you should be watching then to see those initial infections, and then be sure to apply the fungicide before the disease becomes severe.
You mentioned today an optimal window for application of foliar fungicides. What would you define as that optimal window of being for farmers?
There's general feeling with diseases, foliar diseases, is that you have to have the fungicide on there to protect the yield that exists, the yield potential that exists. And so consequently, you want to have the fungicide on there before the disease has become severe, especially severe on the flag leaf or the leaf underneath the flag. And so again, listening to reports from states to the south of you, that will give you an idea of when that disease is coming in. And if you are just starting to see a few pustules of rust on the flag leaf, that's the sign that you should be applying it, especially if you have favorable weather.
Dr. Hunger, you mentioned today in your speech that seed treatments can help protect the yield of a seed, or rather the yield potential. Could you expand a little bit about that?
Well, the seed treatments it's probably a little too early in the life stage of the plant to talk about it protecting yield per se, but it will actually help form that yield potential that you'll see in the plant the next spring, because you're giving it that protection through the fall that will help the plant become vigorous, establish its roots well, grow well. And those are the things then that as you go through the winter that you need to have to keep that plant healthy and have it grow into a mature plant that will have a high yield potential. So it doesn't really protect the yield, it actually would help form the yield potential.
What would be your top 3 management considerations that farmers need to be aware of when managing for fusarium head blight in their wheat crops?
Perhaps the top 3 things that I would recommend growers to look at is their crop rotation. Wheat following corn just has not worked in a lot of the other states. That's where there's going to be the greatest potential for a disaster if you have the right combination of weather during heading and flowering time to get head scabs. So looking at rotating wheat with a broadleaf crop such as soybeans or canola, something like that, something other than corn would be one consideration. A second consideration would be the use of a timely fungicide application to prevent the scab, the pathogen, from infecting the heads during flowering. And of course that would need to be put on somewhere where the heads are fully emerged shortly thereafter when the anthers are exuding and it's flowering. A third thing which should have some applicability is looking at, if they can, the reaction of varieties to head scab before they even plant in the fall. If they anticipate maybe they're going to have a problem with it, there is some information, especially from Kansas. Not all of the hard red winter wheats are known in terms of their reaction, but if they can find some varieties that maybe are rated at least as moderately resistant as opposed to susceptible, that would be a good third step.